this is my palette that I travel with most of the time and use in the studio. I use exactly the same process in the studio as when I'm traveling. Although I have very good news for 2026 is that Schmincke, my palette is made by Schmincke. It's called the Hazel Soan signature palette, and
Wow.
they put it together. There's extra colors in there than come in the signature palette, but I'll talk about that. But in 2026, a new little teeny one, because sometimes it's just too bulky to have a palette that way. So here's a little teaser. This is a prototype, so it's not available yet, but I've been using it in my recent travels, and I'm thrilled with my color choice on it. And so it's very exciting. Let's go through this palette, and then we'll go from here. We'll go from the yellows. I'll explain why some of it's sort of out of order. But basically, yellows are your lightest hue. So they're often the first color laid because watercolorists tend traditionally to work from light to dark. So if this palette had been from new, then probably this yellow would have been here, or maybe the white would have been here. But this is an old palette. This is when Schmincke first made the signature palette for me. And at that point, it didn't have this transparent orange in. So transparent orange in this corner should sort of really be somewhere down here. But it's here in this palette. And once I know where my things are, that's fine, so long as I don't move things around, because I tend to go almost without looking once I know where they are. And because I was learning with a new palette this last trip and using a palette I hadn't had before, it was very interesting that how I had to get familiar with it, because I realized I dip in almost without looking at the color because I know where it is. So let's look at transparent orange, which is a beautiful, very clear, very transparent color made with pyrrole as the pigment. And the kind of thing I might paint with that is something like this elephant here. You'll see this is just that transparent orange and Schmincke violet. And these two secondary colors, in a way, incorporate everything, because the transparent orange has the red and the yellow, and the violet has the blue and the red. Mostly, I don't have ready mixed secondaries in my palette. I don't normally have a green. There is one in this palette. There's some sap green here. But in the signature palette, if you bought a new one from them, original one, there is no green, because I make my greens from blue and yellow. But I'll talk about that as well when we get round to there. So I should talk about. So it's for me, I didn't need originally an orange in my palette, because I made all my secondaries, apart from the violet, with my primaries colors. And so I would make a bright orange with my warm yellow here, which we'll talk about in a minute, Indian, and with ruby red, which in other brands might be called permanent rose. So I didn't think I needed it, but I asked Schmincke what was their most popular color. And they said to me, transparent orange. I said, what? I was so shocked. I thought it was going to be ultramarine blue or burnt sienna. And so I thought, well, I better have it in the palette. So now it's in the palette, because I figured that if other people know something I don't know, I need to know it. And I find I use it a lot. I use it mainly to mix, but sometimes in the Kalahari, it's the perfect color for the Kalahari dunes. So that's the orange. Now let's come to the next color, which is the first of the primaries. So here is my cold yellow. You need a cold and a warm of your main primaries. So this is aureolin, lovely cool yellow. There are other more transparent yellows. There's things like translucent yellow and transparent yellow. There are, and the chrome yellow hues. There are other transparent yellows, and aureolin isn't quite as transparent as them. And I think that's why I like it. I've been debating, because I had to choose, and I had a chance to go for new yellows. I had to really choose in here, as I only had a maximum, sorry, not a minimum of 12. And I tried out and tested a whole bunch of other yellows. And I realized that the reason I use aureolin is not just for its lovely cool yellow, color of sunlight on leaves, that kind of thing, but also because it has this ability to punch in. So you can't see this whole picture because I've got a webcam can't go high enough. But can you see, this is aureolin, and that is dropped into Prussian, and Prussian is a very staining blue. But aureolin has this ability to push pigment out of the way, because there is a little bit of opacity in it. And that's, I think, why I enjoy its use so much, and why I put it, as I say, when I had to choose just a few colors, why it ended up being the cool yellow in the new palette. So next we come to my warm yellow. So you've got a cool yellow and a warm yellow, and this is Indian yellow. You can see how warm it is when you see it beside the aureolin. And as I say, this ideally the orange should either come further down, because in a way it should be closer to the warm yellow or closer to the permanent rose if I was replanning my palette. Now, Indian yellow is one of these glorious colors that just glow, glow, glow. And you can see in a painting like this, these are the poplars. I was in New Zealand in April, and the poplars it was autumn there, and the poplars were absolutely bright yellow. And there was really only one color that could do that, and that was Indian yellow. I mean, there are other warm yellows. There's chrome yellow, hue deep, but it is the color I love. It was originally made from the urine of cows fed on mango leaves, which made it very bright yellow urine. But that was a cruel practice, and thankfully the artists themselves said, this has to be banned, we have to have an alternative. And now Indian yellow is made with two pigments, but and they are, modern carbon pigments, but it's superb, and I've stuck with it again. I've having recently tested these colors for the travel palette, I am utterly convinced it's the right yellow for me. And it makes things glow like this. This is you saw this picture on the screen earlier, and it looks a little bit bleached out under this camera, but it's the warmth here in the dust is the Indian yellow, and then going into the burnt siennas. And it's often a color that I will paint under other things to bring a warm glow. Hannah asked about warmth, and I think that my use of Indian yellow probably contributes to that. Then next to that is raw sienna, which I hardly ever use, and so I haven't got any paintings I can show you of that, but I keep it in my palette because it is a more transparent version of yellow ochre, which I use a lot. And anybody who's painted with me knows that yellow ochre is probably the color I have to fill up the pan the most, along with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And being often painting in Africa, it appears to me to just be the perfect color. And perhaps if I had painted more in England before I went to Africa, I would probably be painting with raw sienna. But because I went to Africa quite early, yellow ochre became my color, and it's the undercolor of many, many of my sketches. So you can see it here. There will be yellow ochre under here. You can also see it in the dust before the blue and the brown are added, the ultramarine and the burnt sienna are added.
Hazel, I do have one question. Could you share again, is it Schmincke Horadam or Schmincke something else?
Schmincke Horadam. Yes, that's a very good question, because it is the artist pigment. And I should have said it myself. It is the artist pigment. And the reason I would tell anybody, don't spend your money on student pigment, because it has to be filled out to make it cheaper. Artist pigment goes a long way. So even though it appears to be more expensive to start with, it is much better value and will last you much longer. A tube of cadmium red could last you 10 years, because it's such intense pigment, depending how many things that are red that you paint. But basically, you don't need dozens and dozens of pigments. You need, I mean, maybe, well, you can have just 12, as you've shown there, but you're probably going to want more if you paint seriously. But 30, this is my main regular palette, and I don't usually need much more than that. I hardly ever, and some of these I hardly ever use either. I mean, really, you can paint with very few colors, so it really behoves you to buy the best pigment. And I would also say best paper and best brushes, because you will learn far quicker with good brushes, good paint, and good paper than you will if you try and work on cheaper alternatives. I mean, I suppose the same with sport, isn't it? Unfortunately, good stuff's expensive, but you won't need to replace it so often. So any other question on that, Hannah?
That was perfect. That helped us all know what you're talking about. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for bringing it up. So coming back to yellow ochre is one of the earth colors, and it's one of the lightest, as is raw sienna. And so yellow ochre is often a base color in a painting. So here we have a landscape scene in Samolo, and this is yellow ochre on the sand, but then I'm using raw umber, which is the next scale up of these earth colors in terms of tone and hue. And raw umber is a much more granulating color than yellow ochre. Raw sienna, incidentally, is granulating. And so if I were to want granulation, but I wanted a yellow ochre hue, then I would use raw sienna. Right, this is earth. So this again is this is painted on Mont Saint-Michel. And so you can see the yellow ochre in there, but then there's also raw umber, and then there is burnt umber. So I've used the earth colors incrementally to build. There's also, I think, is it Prussian blue? Yes, there's Prussian blue in there. But basically, the earth colors are all the same pigment. They're iron oxide. And so you can safely build them into a painting using their tone that is natural to them, i.e. they get darker and darker as they go through yellow ochre, through raw umber, through burnt sienna, through to burnt umber, and even further on with some of the other darker ones. So because it's a single pigment, it's the same pigment. And this is really the whole secret of the limited palette idea, where you use as few pigments as possible, because pigment mixing tends to darkness. That is the nature of pigment mixing. And so I think one of the questions was about how to keep colors fresh and not be muddy. Well, it's by using the least number of pigments in your mixes. That's the secret to keeping colors fresh. So now we've talked about
Hazel, we just got a question from Yasmin's when you talked about granulation, and I think this is a very important one, especially if someone is new to thinking about pigments. When do you want granulation and when do you not want granulation? So if you can weave that into the conversation, that would be wonderful.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because really it's your choice. You could use granulation for the purposes of creating a sense of texture. So then it automatically has obvious leaning to granulation. Or you can use it just because you like the texture. So you can play with it, as an effect. The other good thing about granulation is usually it means the color is lifting, because what happens with granulation is that it's, I think in other countries it's called sedimentary, which sort of explains it better, in that it's sedimentary. It sits into the valleys in the paper. So you can see here, if I bring this up closer to the camera, you can see in this rough paper that it's got hills and valleys. And so the granulating color, this is raw umber with ultramarine blue here. And French ultramarine is far more granulating than ultramarine blue. In Schmincke, it's called ultramarine finest, which gives you the clue, because the finer pigment size is why ultramarine finest is less granulating than French ultramarine, which has larger particle pigments and therefore can sort of drop. It's heavier, so it drops into the valleys. You've got to imagine these pigment particles almost like pixels on a screen. There's zillions of little tiny microscopic particles of pigment. When you rinse them in the water, they don't dissolve in the water, they are held in suspension. So the transparent ones will stay floating because they're usually the lightweight ones, and they'll just tint your color so that you can see through it. That's got some opacity in, so we can't do that. But if I put transparent orange in here, you will see that we can see through it. But if I put, I might as well use that as well, because otherwise I end up with too much dirty water. If I put cadmium red in here, which is opaque, we won't be able to see through it. So you can see that it's quite easy to test and find out what properties your colors have. It is on the tubes. It should be on the tube and pan. The symbols are here. Can you see this? Can I get up close to the camera? That square tells you the opacity or transparency. So the fact it's empty tells you it's a transparent color. The little triangle is the staining properties. So let's find an opaque color so that we can find so we can show you a blocked in square. So here you can see, this is cadmium red medium, and you can see the blocked in square. That tells you that's an opaque color. So the information is all there on your tube, but you can also test it, as I showed you, in the water. You can find out about your colors. And in a way, in your palette, you can sort of see, because the transparent ones tend to be darker, obviously not so as much in the very light hues, whereas the opaque colors like this cadmium red here, and the cerulean blues here, they tend to, you can see their hue more clearly. Can I move on with my palette? So you can see here, this is the raw umber. I hadn't painted it before, but you can just begin to see some of its granulation here. Don't know if you can see it on the screen. Now, next to my raw umber is my darkest earth that I carry in the palette, and this is burnt umber. And this is also a slightly granulating color. And it is a color I don't actually use very often. And so I think it's the only example I've got I could find was that I had used it in here because I wanted to darken up particularly this sky. But I don't find I need it very often because burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, which I use a lot, make more or less the same color with more or less the same properties. And so I don't tend to use burnt umber very much. You can see it up in this corner, and I have used it, I think, in the stripes in here, and I think I used it to deepen this color here. But I keep it in the palette because I want that incremental nature of my earths. And you can see it here settling. I think you can just see the granulation happening as it settles into the paper, as it settles into the tooth of the paper. So next to the burnt umber is another color called light red, which is actually a Winsor & Newton color, which is an opaque version of burnt sienna. And let's put it here. And this I often use when I'm painting two-color elephants like these fellows here, because mixed with ultramarine, it gets a nice gray, and it's just two nice colors mixing together. I use it also a lot when I'm painting figures, if I want to get the color of faces in shadow, and I drop it into the ultramarine as I have done there. Now, what's the next color along? Right, so now let's come to the ruby red. And ruby red in lots of other brands is called permanent rose. It's a quinacridone rose. Quinacridones are a whole bunch of carbon colors discovered around the 50s when, thanks to the auto world, really, because, and to oil, because they really are oil gone backwards. You know, as you know, all the colors squash down to make the black of oil over millions of millennia. But you can break them back the opposite way and get back the red, yellows, and blues from the oil. And quinacridone is one of those carbon colors, and it varies right from quinacridone gold, which unfortunately has now been discontinued, right through to through quinacridone rose, quinacridone red, quinacridone magenta, quinacridone violet. So it goes. It's got a huge range, and it's a wonderful, highly transparent color. Now, what picture have I got for? Oh, I know. I've got some sunsets, haven't I? Where are they? They must be in this book. Are they in this book? Oh, yes, here we go. Some sunrises, actually. These sunrises were painted in Kenya, and this is the permanent rose, and then the Indian yellow and Prussian blue on this side. And yes, it's Prussian blue on both sides, actually. Usually if I'm painting something one after the other, so at the same time, because you can see here the sun hasn't risen yet here, now the sun has risen. I will often stay with the same colors because obviously I don't want to have to keep cleaning my palette, and I want to be quick. And so it's often in my interest not to keep changing colors, but other times I experiment and I play around, and I do change colors, but I do then clean I need to know what's in my mixes on my palette.
Do you have a watercolor sketchbook that you prefer, or paper that you prefer when traveling? Yeah, and also paper that work for really hot climates. So those are some questions that you
I
would be
think I
wonderful to
already alluded to that. I use a lot of cardi paper because I like the fact that I don't tend to draw, I tend to paint. So that's one why I love having this little tiny palette, because you can just shove it in your pocket. Travel brush, Da Vinci make this lovely travel brush that you can take apart. The head goes in, shove that in your pocket, and then I haven't got it here, but I have my water in a little one of those concertina things, they're just tiny little pots, so that they can joggle around on the bottom of a car, for example, or just beside me if I'm sitting down somewhere, and not knock over. So I wouldn't be using things like this because it takes too much water for one thing, because I'm painting all the time. So I don't tend to sketch, I tend to paint. I do use a pencil to tell me where to paint sometimes. But if I can paint, I mean, a lot of my stuff just is painted direct onto the paper. And so the sketchbook I carry is this, or something, a sort of smaller version of, or this sort of thing.
Is that also 100% cotton? Cotton?
Yes, this is Saunders wool. So this is also 100% cotton. Sorry, upside down.
So even you're sketching outdoors, it's still 100% cotton.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
I use the same. My process is the same, indoor and
Yeah.
outdoor. The one life.
I think that what I kind of guessed that that was part of the question, that can we get away with cheaper paper? But you're saying you prefer to paint with the paper that you love to paint on.
And
Uh,
bizarrely, these are not so, they're not silly money. The cardi is a bit less. The thing is, every time, look, I make my living from my painting. So it's not in my interest to not make a good painting when I make it, because
yeah.
it's a good painting. So I don't really like cheap papers, I suppose, because I love the medium of watercolor. I love the paper. I mean, the paper's just divine as well. The brushes are divine. The pigments are divine. The paper,
Yeah.
I love working on stuff I really love. I do have I can't remember what the name of the little moleskin sketches, sketchbooks, which take line better. And I do sometimes do that because sometimes it isn't possible to get water out. So I do to carry little sketchbooks as well, which I can do line thing, but they usually end up with paintings on as well. And just yeah.
And the other question regarding paper is, do you prepare the paper in any way to make it last wet, to make the wetness last longer? For instance, do you wet the back, or do you adjust your technique if you're painting in the yeah savanna, in the Sahara? Or
I do paint with a lot of thick paper. So this is quite thick, if I can, and I don't waste any paper. So if I don't like what's on the front, I paint on the back. And this means I don't have to stretch it. So even in this sketchbook, this paper, I think this is 200 gram, this paper here. I try not to use paper that's too thin, because then it buckles a lot. It will, I use a lot of water, so it does buckle. And one of the beauties of this the cardi paper is that even when it buckles, it doesn't sort of matter, because it's squashed together in a sketchbook anyway. Um, so I tend to I, I don't stretch paper by choice, but that doesn't mean I don't stretch paper, because sometimes when I'm working really big, I do have to basically stop it from buckling, and I will tape it down. So I always have masking tape with me as well, so that I've got the option of taping the paper down as well.